bit of what I wanted to talk about this afternoon, and basically added a piece because I was going to talk a bit about job-driven training, which is something that, well, first of all, can you all hear me okay? Is the audio working for you?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great. So we talked quite a bit earlier about, the different placement tools that we see grantees use, like how they use on-the-job training, what kind of role registered apprenticeships can play. And so I wanted to talk about that, but as we were going through that, I realized, there's some places that maybe we should start before even talking about placement strategy that we didn't necessarily go over, and that's the statement of needs section. So I wanted to bring us back just a couple of steps, talk a little bit about that statement of need section that you might see, some of the pieces that would show a strong and a weaker applicant, and then tie that back to what we were talking about on seeking out appropriate job-driven training resources and employment resources. So we'll do a little bit of both of those this afternoon. And again, just encourage you to jump in, share your experiences and what you've seen, what you think has been effective for programs as they're connecting veterans to those resources.
Can we go around the room and see who's with us this afternoon?
Yeah.
Me, Am is from Chicago.
Donna Winkleski, Oklahoma City.
Phyllis Gay, Baltimore.
Dave C., Minnesota.
Casey Cody, Nebraska.
Chris Nolan, Alaska.
Jason Evans, Honolulu.
Jesse Sardini, New Jersey.
Okay, great.
Marla Milligan, San Diego.
George Rydell, New Mexico.
We've got some other folks that are logged in on the webinar. Jason, did we hear from you? Are you on the line?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Did we miss anybody? Cece, we got you on here too?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Chris Lairdahl from Lansing is on too.
Hi, Chris.
Thank you. Hi.
Is that everybody? All right. Oh, and Ken's going to join us shortly. He got called into a meeting really quickly, but he will join in. He will join in soon enough. Just another reminder, too, the call today is being recorded, and I'm actually going to go ahead and calling in. So he gets on the line, and then because otherwise he won't be able to call in. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about the need and job matching, because if an applicant is doing a really great job talking about all of their wonderful employer relationships, but they didn't actually showcase what the needs were in their area and the fact that veterans who are homeless are in need of employment services in their community, then we might be, there might be applicants that are awarded that have great employer relationships, but HVRP isn't necessarily what they need for their community. So that was kind of the reason for pairing these two pieces together, because they need to showcase that strong need and their understanding of the barriers to employment for veterans in their community, and the pieces that are going to keep veterans from being job ready in their local area, in addition to being able to make the connection to jobs that are available. They've got to have both of those pieces. So when we're looking at the need, when we're looking at the statement of need, there should be a couple of sections that a strong applicant is going to highlight. And these are things that we've actually been talking about in the webinars for applicants, but we've talked about this, every year, and it just makes sense based on what we know of the HVRP program and programs that are successful. They should be able to showcase very clearly what the needs are, who are the homeless veterans in their service area. Unfortunately, there might be some differences in the quality of the data you get for this first piece. Communities, like we talked about in our last call last week, I believe on Wednesday, there are some communities that are part of very intensive national efforts to end veteran homelessness. These are communities that are part of 25 cities, that are part of 0 to 2016, that are part of an SSVF surge grant community. Within these communities, there's an abundance of resources that are being pushed into the community, but there's also an abundance of technical assistance and training to help them better plan around what the local needs are. Those communities are likely to have more up-to-date data than your more rural communities, which might be relying on the point-in-time count from 2014. So I wanted to bring up that nuance because you might see several applicants that are listing data on their homeless veteran point-in-time count from January of 2014 because that's the most up-to-date information that their community has on what the homeless veteran situation is in that area within their continuum of care. You also will have other communities that might have registry data from a month ago. For example, San Diego, because there's a lot happening in that area around all these different surge initiatives, they're doing pretty regular registry weeks, which is where they go out and they're talking to every homeless person who's on the street. They know them by name. They know where they frequent. They have as much information to keep in contact with them as possible. And so they're tracking very regularly what the homeless veteran population looks like, what the numbers are within their local community. Does that make sense? That you might see different levels of the timing on data depending on where a community is located or where a grantee is located?
It does, Bailey, and I don't think a grantee should be penalized if they're using the 2014 data, in part because the continuums of care are not releasing the point-in-time data until just before it's due to HUD, which is May 15th of this year or shortly thereafter. So they literally may not have 2015 data.
Yeah, that's a very good point, John. The way that process works, if anyone has been involved in the point-in-time count, is that the point-in-time counts happen in late January, sometimes early February if there are delays. So that's when local communities within a continuum of care will go out and they'll canvass their continuum to interview every person who's homeless, and they ask about veteran status when they do that. That data gets rolled up to the continuum of care level and then eventually gets rolled up to the national level at HUD, but that process takes a considerable amount of time. There are two reports that come out of that. There's a numbers report and then there's a more detailed demographics report. Just for comparison purposes, the 2013 demographics report just came out a few months ago. So there's a significant lag in that data being released. So just like John mentioned, you might have applicants that are using 2014 data that's not old. That's probably the most up-to-date that they have. If you, and you've got the list, it's up on the website on the CGET page that you'll have access to, and again, I can give you the link to that. There's a listing of the 25 cities communities. Those communities should likely include more up-to-date data than their 2014 because their community is tracking it much more closely.
And in contrast to those, if they are reporting, 2010 data, then they are out of sync and they may not be up to speed on what's going on in their community. At least I would use that as an indicator for a closer look at what they're talking about in their application. But if they're using data that's beyond even 2013, earlier than that, there is definitely more up-to-date information.
That's a very good point. One of the pieces that you might see, they should be using the AHAR, the Annual Homeless Assessment Report data, and that comes from the Continuum of Care. That's the final report that comes from the roll-up of all of that data from the point-in-time count. And there are two sections of it. They might reference a 2014 report or a 2013 report. Anything older than that, like John mentioned, the quality of the data just really isn't that strong. Now, when they're talking about, and that's the first section, does anyone have any questions about this first piece when they're talking about the homeless veterans in the service area? Okay, so you want to see them using AHAR data, Annual Homeless Assessment Report data. For that section, that's going to be, or if they talk about Continuum of Care reports, those are the good pieces of data there. When they're talking about gaps in local services, some communities may just discuss this based on the anecdotal evidence that they have from their agency. A strong applicant would have gone the extra step to ask for their challenge report data from their VA medical center. the VA Medical Center, every VA Medical Center participates in the challenge report. It's spelled CHALENG, and I'll give you a link to that as well. The challenge report is an examination of the major met and unmet needs of veterans who are homeless, who come through the homeless services system at the VA. So it's not going to be everyone who's in contact with the continuum of care report. It's not going to quite be everyone who will be participating in HVRP, but it gives a good snapshot. And we talked a snapshot of what the gaps are in services. And we talked a little bit about that challenge report last week. Now, what that report does is it shows for that medical center what services are still needed that are not being provided. And you'll notice in a lot of cases, in a lot of communities, that a lot of the unmet needs are related to legal services, access to affordable housing, and access to income resources. And so you'll see the connection back to employment at every step within those challenge reports. And I'll pull that up while we're talking here and send that report to you. Now, nationally, there's a roll-up report that's available publicly, but I did confirm with the person who's in charge of the challenge report, and if someone requests their challenge report from their medical center, she will get that to them and do it pretty quickly. So it is possible for them to get that data. That would be an example of a stronger applicant if someone did reference their challenge data when they're talking about the gaps in local services. So that's this piece. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions on that piece? Okay, great. Now, all of this would be in the needs section. And we talked already about, the linkages section and what you might find in the overall approach when it comes to filling those gaps. Again, a stronger applicant is going to be someone who can take a look at the community of services and fill in the gaps with their partners so that they can focus mostly on provision of HVRP services. This is some of what we had talked about in the service area section, staying in, their description of the need. There are a few pieces that they have to include in their application, and then there are some pieces that they really should include. The applicant should designate whether they're an urban or a non-urban applicant. They have access to the right instructions for making that designation. The attachment, I believe it's Appendix E for the HVRP SGA, showcases the 75 metropolitan statistical areas, so the largest area or largest cities within the U.S. If they are within that list, they are urban. If they are not on that list, they are categorized as non-urban. It's very clear. It shows in there that it's based on the 2010 census data. So if you see an applicant that maybe references the 2000 census, they might be using old data. They might be recycling an old application because they should be using the right appendix that's based on the 2010 census. They should outline the geographic area to be served. Now, in reading through the SGA, I noticed that there was a change this time. There's no longer a requirement that they include maps of their service area. So you might not see them include maps. Some of them may, but because it's not a requirement, I'm guessing that a lot of new applicants will not include maps because they don't know that previously they had needed to do that. They should, however, outline the congressional district or districts that they're going to be serving. And interestingly, a change within this SGA from previous years is there is that continued focus on serving Native American tribal areas. Now, you may see applicants that are urban applicants, but they're proposing to partner with an agency that's serving on Native American tribal areas. So you can have both urban and non-urban applicants that are proposing to serve Native American tribal areas. I just know that that is a possibility. In the previous SGA, there was just a focus on Native American tribal agencies being a non-urban designation, but in this SGA, they can be either. And we're guessing that if, it does come across that way, that it's likely to be a service agency that's connected with a Native American tribal service group. those are some of the basic pieces that, you know, you can really just check off when you're looking at the application. They've got the congressional district. They marked off that they're urban or non-urban. But then what's the really nitty-gritty of how they're defining the need? Because it should be more than just there are, through the 2014 point in time count, there are 100 veterans who are homeless. So we will assess 100 and we will enroll 85. They should go into a little bit more detail when they're outlining the needs, especially now. As we talked about last week in one of our phone calls, we're seeing changes in the homeless veteran population as we've got an aging veteran group. And we'll talk about a little bit about supported employment at the end of this, as Ken had alluded to in our last week's call. So you have an aging group of veterans who are encountering significant disabling conditions, compounding medical issues that make return to employment very difficult for them. You want to see applicants that address that group, but you also want to see that applicants are aware of the growing need of veterans who are just becoming homeless. So they should be aware of and taking account of the poverty and unemployment numbers in their community, because there may be a huge pocket of veterans who are extremely low income, who are going to be highly vulnerable to homelessness in their community. And the HVRP program can show that, listen, we're going to be a needed resource for these veterans as they're demobbing into our community. You know, just to give an example, maybe Colorado Springs is going to have a significant number of servicemen and women who demobilize in the next 2 years. And this is just, you know, a hypothetical example. An applicant from that area could showcase that that there's a significant percentage of that demobbing population that's extremely low income, that's in poverty, maybe through results that they can show from a comparable supportive services for veteran families program or other resources that's tracking, you know, poverty and unemployment numbers. And so they're showing a bigger picture. So it's veterans who are currently homeless and on the streets, and also veterans who are very likely to be at extremely high risk and accessing HVRP services in the next year. It shows that awareness of the changes within the homeless veteran population. And that's a little bit more nuanced. This is also their opportunity to, again, address some of those supportive services gaps and talk about the employment barriers. And those are the pieces that I just talked about for the individual veterans, how they might have significant medical conditions that serve as barriers for employment. They might talk about compounding legal needs and the fact that they're working with veterans who have multiple felonies or who are registered sex offenders, and those are pieces that are directly related to the veteran but are also institutional that can lead to them having barriers to employment. And then there are pieces that don't necessarily have to do with the veteran, him or herself, that serve as employment barriers. Things like having a depressed labor market, having a decline in industry, having an increase in highly skilled labor but a decrease in low-skilled labor in their community, so fewer job options that are available, having limited training resources, possibly having limited transportation resources. So these are structural issues that serve as employment barriers in their community that impact the veterans but don't necessarily have to do with those veterans in particular.
I just would expect a grantee as part of this section to talk a little bit about the justice-involved veteran in some detail, since that subpopulation is a significant one likely to be in HVRP and also presents as unique for creating employer partnerships and job-driven training. You know, despite our efforts around engaging employers and in-demand occupations, the justice-involved veterans may present some complications to that mix, and so an applicant should be cognizant of those related issues and talk about that in their application.
Yeah, that's a really good point, John. I don't know if anyone on the line has worked with those applicants. There are certain programs, especially those that maybe had IVTP in the past when IVTP was around, and they really do focus on veterans who are transitioned out of incarceration. That's continuing to be a growing segment of the population that we see who are eligible for homeless services, including HVRP. has anyone seen that with any of the grantees that you've had, that they've had a focus specifically on veterans who are transitioning from incarceration? None. What about in San Diego? Riley, I feel like there's got to be some for our San Diego folks. They're also working with a lot of younger veterans from what they last told me.
I think there's also a couple of justice-involved veterans in Baltimore.
This is Willis Gay in Baltimore. We had such a program, but the grant was not renewed a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And
it's located in Frederick, which is very close to a federal prison in Hagerstown. I think it's Hagerstown. And they really would like to have it again. They did real well with the program, but now they're doing an HVRP program since the incarceration grant was not renewed.
Right. We were all disappointed that couldn't happen this go-round, but definitely your existing grantees are wrestling with that population.
Interestingly enough, at the Hagerstown facility, I think that's where the state penitentiary is, actually has a veterans club, has about 50 or 60 members, and when I worked at the Hagerstown AJC, I visited there a couple of times. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that grantee in particular, I know that they've still continued to serve that population as much as they can. You do have some programs that have done HVRP for a long time, and I could think of a bunch, but I won't name them. I'm sure you oversee quite a few of them that even though they no longer have IBTPs, still continue to focus that direction and really do choose to serve the hardest of the hard to serve. We're not involved, John and I are not involved in the scoring of the applications, but those applicants really are the ones who are making change in their local communities to ensure that veterans who are most in need have access to the potential to have a real life again. So be conscious of that.
That population can be serviced fairly well through HVRP as well.
Very much so. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It would be an oversight if an applicant doesn't talk at all about justice-involved veterans because it is so prevalent.
Especially because this SGA in particular outlines the role of legal services and the need to both identify supportive service gaps related to legal services, but also fulfill them through community partnerships.
Yeah.
So an applicant would be remiss if they did not talk about the legal needs of veterans who are homeless and who are transitioning from incarceration.
So this is Marla Milligan. I think I got cut off right as I went to speak, so my apologies if you didn't hear from San Diego. But in San Diego, we have a major Connections housing downtown, and they do a lot of transitioning with the incarcerated veterans. We've seen a lot of them get back to work, actually working somewhere in the Connections housing themselves. So it's been a great program in success here.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I knew that they were doing some good work in San Diego. You've got a couple of really solid programs down there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think San Diego has the toughest time ending homelessness for veterans because it's a destination homelessness spot.
Right. That's where everybody. Yep.
Yeah. That's not to downplay what you're dealing with out there in Hawaii because that's a real difficulty as well. It's very challenging, not because they're not being successful with veterans who are there, but because veterans continue to go there who are in need of services. So, okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that, John. So this is just a bit of what we had talked about on the importance of the AHAR report and how you might see applicants when they're talking about their need reference this annual homeless assessment report. It should be newer than 2013 because prior to 2012, veterans supplemental data was separate, and then at that point, the veteran data got folded into the larger AHAR report as a component of that total report. So really, data before 2013 is old. They can do better than that. It's available. As we mentioned, the continuum of care reports from the 2014 point in time count might be the most recent ones that they have available. Let me talk a bit.
Just as a reminder, Bailey, is just if people report the point-in-time counts, like I was just down in a Florida community, and their 2015 count was 91 veterans. That's not their annual number of homeless veterans in their community. Right. So just a reminder that this is a point in time. So it was on one night in January there were 91 homeless veterans, but that could mean that there were 220 or more homeless veterans during the course of a year. So just to keep that in mind, that we easily forget that the point in time is just the moment, that one evening, as opposed to the full year. So don't take it as a low level of need if they say they had 54 homeless veterans on a point in time night.
That's a very good point, John, and that's where you'll want to look to that quality of linkages section to see how they're outlining how they're involved in their local efforts to end veteran homelessness overall, because you do want to see that they're part of bigger planning efforts to make sure there's stability of resources throughout the entire year, not just in that point in time. The point-in-time count, we've heard anecdotally, can also disproportionately underrepresent veterans who are homeless or individuals who are homeless in rural areas. We have heard that from some programs, and again, that's anecdotal, but you might see that reflected in a non-urban application if they do list their point-in-time count and say, we believe that the actual number needing services over the span of a year is significantly higher. I mentioned on the fourth part of the needs section how when they're talking about the specific and unique employment barriers that local HVRP participants might face, that can be specific to the veterans who were homeless, but it could also have to do with the system that's in place and the institutional structure that's there. So they should, as much as they can, give detailed labor market information. There's plenty of information out there that's available to them. They might reference My Next Move. They might reference My Next Move for veterans. They might provide ONET information. They might talk about how they're directly connected to their American Job Center. But those should be the resources that they're using for their labor market information to show what those trends are locally and how they're planning to address them to help overcome some of the barriers. But an applicant that just says, there's not a whole lot of jobs in our community, but we'll do our best, is a lot weaker than one that says, here are 3 of the growth industries, here are 2 of our regular growth industries, but they've subsided over the past 10 years. If you had an applicant from Pittsburgh that says, we used to place a lot of people in steel and coal mining, but that's a declining industry, so we don't focus on that as much. It's kind of an extreme example, but just giving you an idea of how they might outline some of the changes within their local labor market, both for the positive and on the barrier side. Here's just some of the resources that I mentioned that they could use. They might use ONET resources. There's so many tools that are available for them to pull together local labor market information. They should be able to put some significant weight within that section. All right, so does that all make sense, how they can outline the need and how important that is to building the bigger picture of providing employment services? Because they could have all these great employer relationships, but if they're in a community where there's no need or very, very low need, there's not really any point in having HVRP there when there's so much need elsewhere. So if we're tying it back to the job-driven training like we were talking about earlier today and the efforts that HVRP grantees can take to implement job-driven training principles, if you think about what motivated that move toward job-driven training, it's these 3 principles here, and a lot of this comes from the report put out by the Vice President's Office, by the White House, on implementation of job-driven training. So there's that recognition that you have employers that are seeking skilled workers for jobs that need to be filled now, but they can't find those workers. And you have workers on the other extreme who are looking for jobs, but they don't necessarily know about the resources that are available for training that might be in their community. Obviously, veterans who are homeless are very vulnerable and are likely to not have access to all of the great training resources that might be available to someone with more significant means. Then in the middle, you have a very critical part of HVRP, even more so in the last 2 years with the change toward job-driven training, and that's those education and training programs that serve as that sort of feedback loop, that connection point between the veterans who are homeless, who are seeking employment opportunities and training, and the employers that have those in-demand jobs that they're trying to fill now. And the HVRP needs to serve that role of communicating not just with employers but also with the education and training entities that are going to make the connection between the job seeker and the employer on the other side. And we talked some about the job-driven training principles and what all that involves earlier today, so I won't spend too much time on this, just to say that there's that strong reliance on employer partnerships, not only for the applicant, but also for their partners. So they need to show that they're working closely with the American Job Center, and if they're proposing to provide training through a trade school or some other association that does provide training, we talked about unions earlier today, what a great resource those can be, that there needs to be actual employment opportunities on the other side of that training. Increasingly, we're seeing this movement away from classroom-centered training. Some applicants will still offer that, and we always help them differentiate between basic life skills training and actual employment training that would count as training within their 80% minimum requirement. But we're seeing that move as programs are really thinking through what's a successful way to help veterans obtain jobs, and that's really moving it out of the classroom setting into the workplace. I won't talk too much about OJT unless there was anything else that's on here that I missed or that we missed earlier, John. Let me know. I think we did a good coverage of OJT earlier. Now, I wanted to talk just briefly about the apprenticeship model because this has been in the SGA for several years. We have been looking very closely. I ask grantees about it every time I'm working with one, about if they've had success getting veterans signed up through registered apprenticeships. There's very seldom success in the formal RA registered apprenticeship model. If you have, I don't know if anyone has good examples of grantees in their area who have been able to connect veterans to registered apprenticeships. I always ask about that. I'm always looking for, and I'm sure John is too, looking for good solid examples of that working well. I don't think you'll see too much of this in your HVRP applications, but just know that if you don't see it, it's not necessarily a huge flaw within the application. It's a really difficult thing to set up, mostly because most of the apprenticeships require a pretty significantly high skill set to start off with, and the length of time in the apprenticeship could be fairly lengthy. It might be longer than their time in the HVRP program. Has anyone had any success or seen grantees that have had success doing registered apprenticeships or setting up apprenticeship models? John, do you know of any programs that have done this well?
Well, I think our best example we talked a little bit about this morning in Hawaii and their partnership with the construction industry and the union there for laborers. But they're more difficult to establish, so we don't have lots of apprenticeship connections.
Yeah, and maybe we can, we'll have to talk about that after this whole process to see if maybe we could do a case study on how they were able to make that work, because, cracking that code with the unions is something I know a lot of programs have tried to do, and it's been a challenge. So if you see that in an applicant, that would allude to a real strong, real strength, but be sure to look and make sure that the registered apprenticeships or the relationships that they have set up are, shorter than a year-long time frame for veterans who are going through it.
That's part of the challenge. Many of the apprenticeships are longer than that, and that's why it makes it particularly difficult.
So one of the pieces that Ken had asked us to cover with you briefly, and I won't spend too much time talking about this, but I'm happy to share resources on it. We talk a lot about, within the homeless veteran services world, the increase in the number of young veterans who are experiencing homelessness. But what we miss in this picture sometimes is the reality that there's a significant chunk, and the majority of veterans who are still on the streets, who are eligible for HVRP, who have very significant compounding barriers to entry to employment. And most of the time these veterans are older. They've got co-occurring mental health issues. They've got with substance use issues. They also are experiencing the impacts of aging much earlier because of their time on the streets. These are veterans who are often connected through the HUD-VASH system to permanent supportive housing, but sometimes that takes time. Sometimes they're not eligible. Sometimes they fall back into homelessness. And so for those individuals that really need a more significant intervention to help them establish stability overall in life, and especially in employment, there are supported employment interventions that some agencies have employed to help those individuals, and it's not veteran specific, but to help those individuals better achieve employment. And so just wanted to talk briefly about one model, because this is the one that we work most closely with. We do work pretty closely with Dartmouth Psychiatric Research Center up in, I believe they're in New Hampshire. And they pioneered a model of supported employment called IPS, the Individual Placement and Support. And their model, we tend to lean most toward this model of all the different supported employment interventions because it is an evidence-based practice. I'll show in a slide or so some of the results that they've had from the interventions that they've done. And again, they're not veteran-specific, but there are some learnings that programs can take here and apply to their work with veterans who are homeless. So you'll see some of the major characteristics of IPS supported employment here. It's very much so a strengths-based approach and focused on rapidly getting individuals into employment using a full multidisciplinary team approach, so involving their doctors, case managers, families, staying engaged with employers. Your first thought, which was ours also, was this seems like a very intensive intervention. I'm not sure that an HVRP case manager with 70 people on their caseload could do that intensive of an intervention. There are some adherence to fidelity that HVRP programs would not be able to keep to. We talked about this when we first brought up evidence-based supported employment, that the fidelity of sticking to, is it under 20, John? Under 20?
20 or less.
Yeah, 20 or less. People on your caseload is probably unlikely for an HVRP case manager, but there are some of the practices that they can implement, and these are some of the pieces that we wanted to bring up for you here. So these are the core principles of IPS, and if you see this reflected in an application, it just gives you an idea of what it is they're trying to focus on. And just a couple of the highlights, they really do want to get individuals connected to competitive employment. And so if they just toss in, well, we use supported employment, but they're talking about sheltered workshops, they're kind of missing the ball there. Because the focus of IPS is moving people into competitive employment as rapidly as possible. That job search begins immediately, and the goal is pretty immediate placement. It does involve that integration with the rehab and mental health services. For veterans, that might mean integrating their SSVF case manager, maybe their practitioner through the VA Medical Center, and the other partners that are involved in helping that veteran maintain stability. So again, it is a more intensive intervention. The thinking behind IPS supported employment is that any person who expresses an interest in working should have access to the resources to help them go back to work. Again, that's an area where you might see a little tension with some HVRP programs because they will do an assessment to see if someone is job ready before enrolling them in the program. As I mentioned, this is a very client-centered model. There's a big focus on keeping the focus on the worker preferences on what the individual actually wants to do. One of the resources that we often suggest for HVRP grantees, if they're trying to both maintain a client-centered case management approach, but also help veterans be very realistic in their work preferences, is to use the My Next Move tool, to use the ONET tool of the skills assessment, because it's online, it's pretty easy to use, it moves quickly, it's a good opportunity to work with individuals who maybe don't have high computer literacy, to help them with this resource. And the great thing about doing that skills assessment is on the other side, it gives you a list of all of the possible employment opportunities within your education and training level that best fit what your interests are. And that's a good way for programs to open up a conversation about what other opportunities might be a good fit for us to look for. Maybe you say you want to be a doctor, but after we do this after we do the skills assessment with you, interest assessment with you, we see that your interest is mostly in helping people, and that's why you wanted to be a doctor. Why don't we see if we can find you a role as a peer manager, or a peer support specialist within our homeless services system? So it's a good resource for them to maintain that client-centered case management model, but also be responsive to the realities of the labor market and what kind of job opportunities are available to people. And just again, that there are some programs that might mention IPS-supported employment. I don't think you'll see it in a ton of applications, but I think we'll start to increasingly see organizations incorporate some of these principles, because while it's a more intensive intervention that involves more players at the table, continuous meetings for veterans, this is the direction that a lot of services are going, on that comprehensive case management approach where you've got multiple partners at the table talking about each veteran to ensure that there's that continuity of care. So this is just so you'll be aware of it if a program does bring up supported employment or IPS supported employment in particular.
Or if they bring up in their application their interest in serving chronically homeless veterans, of which there still is a population out there, this actually, IPS would be the preferred intervention with that population. So if they do mention that they want to have a percentage of their clients who are chronically homeless, they should identify some of those IPS elements in their application, if not all of them. So if they identify the need, is the intervention that they're coming up with suitable to the need?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And there is that dual model, that they'll need more intensive interventions for some of the veterans they're proposing to serve, and stronger applicants will propose to serve veterans who are chronically homeless. That is a focus within the SGA, and one that we do want to see, applicants that are maintaining that focus in an area where there are veterans who are still chronically homeless on the streets. Here's just a little bit of information on outcomes for supported employment, just in case you're wondering, well, how effective is it? It is an evidence-based practice. And they've done interventions with several populations, including individuals who are homeless, older adults, and those who are involved with the criminal justice system. So you'll see that several of the service populations for IPS-supported employment have overlap with veterans who are eligible for and might be interested in HVRP services. Those are the big pieces that I wanted to outline. Again, I tweaked a couple of things because I realized we hadn't talked too much about need, and realized that was probably an important section for us to cover. So John and others, I hope you don't mind that I just tossed that in there because I just thought it was important. Do you have questions at all on the needs section, on how that shows connection to smart employment services, or really anything that we had talked about today? I know Rebecca's not on the line from this morning's call, but we can cover it if there are questions that had come from earlier today. Are you all getting really excited to grade these applications?
Oh, yeah.
I'll take that as a resounding yes. Now, we only have 2 more training sessions with you. On Wednesday, this is our last time together for this year at least. And in the morning, we're going to talk, well, morning being 12 p.m. Eastern, we're going to talk about housing strategies. And then 4 p.m. Eastern, we're going to talk about job retention and follow-up strategies. So if you have any questions, Wednesday will be our last time together, but I'm sure John agrees, we're here available however you need us. Of course, I don't think Ken ever got online. He's probably still in his meeting. But just circle all questions through Ken so that he stays in the loop because he's the lead on the process. And we're here to serve you. If you need additional resources as you head into that grant review process, know that we're here to help. All right, well, thank you all. I hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave.
Bye-bye.